Welcome everyone to ALN Thursday at 4. My name is Mike Bordenaro. I am the Communications Director for the Asset Leadership Network, and we're very happy today to have Michael Hardy talking with our CEO, Jim Dieter. And before we let them start the chat, I would like to thank our sponsors, and I wish my computer would cooperate and let me move through the sponsors, which include ABS Quality Evaluations, which is the April sponsor for the ALN Thursday at 4. ABS Quality Evaluations provides the certification to ISO 55001 and other standards, including ISO 9000 and all the ISO standards and other standards also. They have been the certification body for the Raytheon ISO 55001 certification and the Atlanta Airlines Terminal Corporation ISO 55001 certification. And they have offices in the US and also throughout Mexico and South America. I also want to make sure everybody knows that we have the support of our other member organizations, which I am calling up now here in just a second here. So we wouldn't be able to bring you this program and other events without the support of our member organizations. Like I said, including ABS Quality Evaluations. All of our presentations are available on podcasts and webinar recordings. You can find those on our website. And if you have questions or comments, please put them in the questions or chat section of the toolbar. And now, thank you. And I'll turn it over to Jim Dieter to have a talk with Michael Hardy.
Well, thank you, Michael. And it looks like I didn't get the tie memo today. That's only the second time Mike's wore a tie this last year because he's Michael Bordenaro. Now, Michael Hardy, you probably wear a tie all the time. Michael, you go into your office, is that right?
I do go into my office, and whenever I can get an opportunity to put on a tie, reminds me of the old days, pre-COVID days. So I take the opportunity when I can.
The before times, right?
The before times, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm actually not up in the cabin in the woods today with the fire, but it's cold enough here that I figured I'd have my hair on fire with the fireplace behind me today.
Very nice.
But great to have you, Michael. I always enjoy talking to you, as we like to say of these ALN Thursdays at 4. It's sort of we miss having in-person meetings and conferences. And I've had many great conversations at such events with Michael out in the hallway between sessions or over lunch. So we try to keep it in that vein of interesting and hopefully useful information. So, and Michael, usually we start with an origin story. So asset management and Michael Hardy, and how did you get to today from wherever you want to start?
Yeah, so I used to be, part of my early career was really involved in technology, and I had the opportunity to work at a company that was doing a lot of GIS work, mapping, which led us through a customer we had with the Air Force into, literally answer the question like, well, our maps are really great, on our bases, but like the one problem with our GIS is that all the most valuable assets are like drawn boxes, like as if they were cookie cutter stamped out of the map texture. So everywhere there was a building, there was a box or a funny shaped polygon. And so you'd have like, practically down to the blade of grass everywhere else. And then, the place you store your airplanes or You know, the place where you have, 10 stories of officers and civilian personnel, just a box. So so the company I worked for really took, and people smarter than me there really solved that problem, which led me into a connection to facilities, and then eventually just sort of staying with that theme on the technology into facilities management, and then asset management, and people like Jack Dempsey got me connected to ALN, and I really started to learn then. Really wasn't until ALN when I started to understand what asset management was really about. And I think probably before then I really had pretty traditional idea that asset management was like maintenance management, pretty much the same thing. And so I got a real great education right away that was just a tiny piece of it. So
Well, that's good. And so now you're working for Bureau Veritas, and then
yeah.
my first introduction to ISO and management system standards was doing asset management for Allied Signal, which became Honeywell. And my boss was supposed to be on, was the head of contracts. What was she? I guess she was the head of contracts. And she was supposed to be on this configuration review board for ISO 9001 implementation, because they had signed up for it in a NASA contract we were supporting. So I was their designee to go to the meetings. That was a great opportunity. I learned a ton. I learned just a ton about it, about management system standards and 9000 and what all that means, and made a lot of interesting connections. But the Bureau Veritas connection was they were our, they are the ones that did our certification. So are you involved in that at Bureau Veritas, or what all does Bureau Veritas do?
Yeah, so it's a almost 200-year-old company that does operates really in an industry we call TIC, or training, inspection, and certification. So as you can imagine, a big global company, there are some pretty big divisions across the world, really.
Yeah.
So I don't work in certification, and there is, as you can imagine, for good reasons, some some firewalling among the various divisions.
Sure, has to be.
So I work in buildings and infrastructure,
Mhm.
and within that we do asset management and a bunch of others. I would sort of say field work and services work, consulting, and certification. My connection there is only collaborative, I guess. So a couple weeks ago, I had the opportunity to introduce one of the managers in our certification division to Jim Whitaker, because they were asking about ISO 45000
Mhm.
and for facilities management. So I certainly try to play a role of being an advocate for ISO generally in the company, but I'm focusing on building up a sort of consulting capability, which, like I said, necessarily creates a firewall between us and certification.
Yeah. So when I guess as a previous employer, when you first got involved in the ALN, and you were working, doing some really interesting things with DC government. Can you share a little bit about that and the success story there?
Yeah, that was a really great experience for me. DC government has a really forward view of asset management, very holistic, taking into account how asset management really ties to financial management. And again, they really embraced the idea that it's, the sort of asset leadership part of it is really a planning activity, so that they can guide the various departments within the district to have the resources that they need to, everything from the chief financial officer, which, you know, was able to speak at one of our conferences a couple years ago,
Yeah, that's
to,
great.
their financial management system, their capital planning groups, their construction outfits, their maintenance, and really tying that into one coordinated planning activity. Um, you should always learn something from, every customer you have if your life is going well. But that one was really an extraordinary experience for me, and just the way that they approached it, I really, really valued that time there.
So, but they had a really significant measure, right, about their bond rating. I always like to
Oh,
tell that story.
I know, it's amazing. People, have some story in their heads about, hearing on the news, a decade ago, what sort of a financial train wreck the district was at that time, and really poorly rated bonds, and which, people probably know has a detrimental impact on a city's budget and their ability to borrow. Um, but after just a few years, with Jeff DeWitt running the CFO there, they were able to get all three of the major um, bond raters, Moody's and Standard and Poor, and I think there's a third one, that basically gave them the equivalent of sort of A+ ratings on their bonds, based in a large part on their um, the way that they could forecast their capital needs and their spend. It was, really a remarkable turnaround story.
Yeah. And I remember a number. There was a number associated with that, right? That it saved them how many millions of dollars?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know for sure. It's a huge number. Just
Yeah,
to go from whatever, I'm not an expert in the bonds, but
yeah,
to go to these sort of a little better than junk rated bonds to, A+ saves them, tens of millions of dollars a year in borrowing costs, I'm sure.
good. So I also remember that they were our hosts and provided a lot of the students through your efforts uh, for the first AJAG training course leading to
Right.
the A55K certification that we offer. You have any thoughts on that, looking back on it now? Or
Oh yeah. So I was excited to be part of that inaugural class myself. And, um, we had few folks from federal government there, um, folks like me from industry, number of people from DC government. Um, and I think I also came away from that experience thinking, well, I thought I understood the standard. I've taken part in a lot of, education about it. I've read it multiple times, had lots of conversations about it. But the class, which, between sort of your leadership of it and the AJAG instructors that participated, it was, I don't know, just the way that it was, methodically kind of putting it all together. We did that in a matter of a few days, and it was just, I think, the value of laying it all out. You could really see how the pieces of it tied together, and there's still, you know, I don't know, this sort of embedded a familiarity with the standard that, sort of never very far from, what I'm thinking of, even when I'm having, we'll say, unrelated conversations. It still goes back to things like, you know, leadership buy-in. It's got to start there, and then, defining your asset management system, and that does not mean software. and et cetera, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it was great. And, I think I certainly have recommended it to a number of people just because
Yeah, good.
it's not the same as, I get this big, 3 big documents and I read, 55,001, 2, and 3, and now I get it. It was really valuable.
You know what I've found when uh, I think it's true this course and what I hear you saying, but I've been to a lot of training classes. Some I found very valuable, some so-so, and some terrible, honestly. But that a really good training class is like before the class, you can see the ocean, and you sort of dive in. And a good class, you might not know every square inch of the ocean, but you see where the shores are. You sort of see you get the lay of the land or the lay of the sea, to stretch an analogy.
Yeah.
But, and then classes that aren't so good, it's like, well, there's a bunch of water and fish, but do I have the whole thing? Do I get it? And I think it answers that question. So yeah, good.
Yeah, and I was just chatting with Walt Keys, who is another one of the students
Oh, yeah.
from
Oh,
that
yeah.
class, and he's now over at the U.S. Marshal Service,
Oh, yeah. Oh.
and he's tackling some, asset management issues over there, and actually is trying to evaluate, some software to try to, help them manage that better. But yeah, and we were chatting about, some of our experiences from that course and how, that relates to what he's doing now. So, I think that's, again, I couldn't recommend it enough for anybody that's interested in the course.
And you and I, had a chance to start working on a project that's still sort of waiting for a home, but a sort of a simplified conception of how to implement an asset management system. And it really was, it came out of or was related to the work in that class, where part of the class is to develop a draft or a mock strategic asset management plan. And I think, my takeaway from it was, wow, there's all these things and all these criteria and the standard, but when you get right down to it, there's not that many things that are really different in the standard from what you're already doing. So if people think it's really complicated, it's maybe not so much. And if you do the work of creating a strategic asset management plan, then you can see what the work is. But until you at least start that process, I don't see how you see what the work is.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it, actually. You got to see where the connections are.
Yeah. So how about now? What kind of projects are you working on? Anything you can share with us?
Yeah, so I think we're, I think the long-term goal, and I think we're starting to get there, is still to be able to, really develop more of a consulting capability around ISO 55,000 and maybe 45,000 in any ways that they kind of relate. But I have been involved in launching a support practice around around personal property assets.
Ah,
I know is near and dear to your heart.
that's where I grew up. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not, it's not really where I've lived, being sort of a facilities guy, and not really where we've played as much before.
Yeah.
But we've had the opportunity through connections in the manufacturing industry to
Yeah.
start, looking at the connections essentially between the, kind of storeroom management and how that relates to their, maybe ERP systems, and then, related to that, the more traditional facilities and site condition assessment work and sort of needs long-term capital planning. They have points of intersection, which again, I think without sort of ISO 55,000, I wouldn't necessarily have seen those connections before. And so now I think that's what's kind of led this initiative to be on that, sort of personal property inventory control side, to see how they kind of come together. So that's exciting. Like I said, that's sort of what's been, front of my mind for the last, few months, actually.
Yeah, spent a lot of years doing that kind of work. I think what people, and it's how to compare it to real property and infrastructure is an interesting question. But I'd love to be able to put some numbers to the concept, which is, they talk about just in federal government, and maybe the numbers are a couple of years old now, but the government had like 1.5 trillion of real property and 1.7 trillion of personal property.
Mm.
And then you think about that and you go, so that's just an interesting statement. But then you think, well, and they're really only counting, in a lot of cases, they're only talking capital property, and they have very high capital thresholds a lot of time. So that probably doesn't count most IT assets or,
Oh, right.
Lots of things. And it's like, wow, I wonder what the real number is. And then you think, well, so you're talking about the real property, and that's stuff you have for 30, 50, 100 years. And the personal property, you're turning over every 3 to 5 years, most of it, some of it 10 years, some of it longer. But you think, so if you had a 10-year, if everything that's at a 10-year window and you had 1.5 trillion of real property, the personal property over that 10-year period, it's 1.7 trillion. It turns over 3 times. That's 5.1 trillion. I mean, is that any kind of a reality? Is that?
I think so. I mean, and if you start to get down into, the real, like I think everything you've said is true about kind of, even on the personal property side, the long hold kind of capital eligible pieces, that you're going to tag and track and do all that. But what about sort of, Jack Kelly's, world when he was at OMB, and he was concerned with things that are just almost, like one step above consumables, just all the sort of individual, gear that's fit out for people. And it's, remarkable to think of what that number, really looks like. Or in this project that, BV's doing now with the kind of this, parts inventory and kind of, lean manufacturing 5S stuff. It's, they're trying to optimize that, sort of those assets for higher turnover. Like they want to hang on to them for, less than a year if they can, or have just the right amount.
Yeah.
But it is, but as we're kind of planning some of this out, it's like the concepts are the same. It's about optimizing the value. You have those assets for a reason. What's the value they're contributing? It really doesn't matter if it's, the part to a machine, or if it's, a system in the building, or if it's the site itself. It's you've got to maximize, or you've got to manage that to the value it provides, which means you need to understand that. And that's I think that's where it comes back to, what's the strategic, asset management plan? What are you trying to accomplish with your assets? What's the point of even owning them, right? So yeah, so we do a lot of services that support various pieces of that. And honestly, my goal here is to tie them all together and have it be sort of one way of thinking about assets, whether we're doing, like I said, 20-year capital plan, facility condition assessments, or if we're helping a, multi-site manufacturer optimize their, parts inventory. It's all the same.
All right, so I think maybe I have time for one more question before Mike. It looks like Mike might have some questions lined up. But so what's your view of the future? I know I see just like a flood of new information hitting around asset management, and it's popping up everywhere. Where do you see it going, and where do you see, what should people be thinking about?
Yeah, well, I mean, my sort of worn out, answer to this question, it feels worn out. I think I really do see it as important to tie things together. And so I think the future is going to be about getting kind of out of these stovepipes. So like, oh yeah, that's personal property, that's its thing. Oh, that's fleet, that's another thing. Oh, that's real property, that's another thing. And that's sort of the opposite of putting that umbrella over the top of having a strategic asset management plan and understanding what the value is in owning assets at all. And honestly, what's sort of dominating, future think is things like, the administration's new infrastructure
Yeah.
plan. You know, trillions of dollars are going to flow.
Yeah.
And I think, it's a distinction that's made. How is that going to benefit, us stakeholders, we stakeholders?
Right.
And I don't expect, to be able to solve that problem and have everybody, get on the same page about everything. But, if we did have a strategic, plan nationally that everybody had adopted, then I know trillions of dollars would be well spent. And I, obviously don't think that's exactly how it will go.
I would love to hear Biden say the words asset management, and with the basic thought that crumbling infrastructure, we get that. Plan to spend money, we get that. But what about, how are we going to keep this from happening again? Are we going to let this infrastructure crumble again? Because my God, we know we got people that know how to do it. It's the political or capital will, to set aside the money to maintain the bridges and the roads and the airports, instead of continually stealing money from it.
Right. If it were easy, like we'd already be doing it, right? And everybody would, think for the long term. And that is something that I would, love to see changed for sure.
Yeah, it's good.
If I can comment, it might not be easy, but it's possible.
It
And
is.
it's now more possible with the guidance of ISO 55000.
Well said.
So we do have questions, and since we're running up to the end of time, I'm going to ask Mike, can you stick around for overtime?
Yeah, I can stay for a few.
We'll take a few minutes, but I want to take a moment to once again thank our organizational members, not our entire list of people, but
He's trying to prove to Nick that we miss him.
yeah, our production director is not available today. So thank you to our sponsors, our organizational members who make this possible, especially to ABS Quality Evaluations, who provides certifications. And I would like to also say that next week, Bill Brodt, who is a facilities engineer with NASA, has said he will be our guest if
Awesome.
everything works out properly. And if he's not able to make it next week, he said he would be a guest in the future. So I'd like to start with a question from Dr. Annette Kampf-Deeren. Michael, what are the most important prerequisites and first steps for an organization to tie it all together to start strategic asset management?
So I think the first thing that needs to be in place is sort of the will and support of top management. There isn't any way to for a whole organization to take on tying all the pieces together without, I would say not without, but with sort of, leadership from below. It doesn't work that way. And so I think when those situations come up, what we get is, a situation where somebody in an organization is like, well, I don't have that top buy-in for the whole thing, but I'm going to define my box and get started and show everybody else how it's done. So that's great. But for an organization to really take on breaking down the silos, connecting the dots, it's got to start with leadership and the support from the people at the very top.
So I want to recognize Annette is Annette Compdern is Dr. Annette Compdern is a member of TC 251 representing Germany, and she's joining us from Germany today and will be a future guest on ALN Thursday at 4.
That's awesome.
And Doctor, if you have any further comments or questions, please put them in the chat, or we can make you live, like we are giving a live microphone to one of our other questionnaires. There were a number of comments about tying real property to personal property. And one of those comments was made by your fellow senior ALN senior fellow, Art Kurland, but also Lindsay Ziegler from the Andrew James Advisory Group. So, and Lindsay had another question. Lindsay.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, let me ask the question, but then you can talk with Michael afterwards.
Sure.
Lindsay wonders how the class informed where you are and where your organization is now.
Yeah, so, well, I don't know, I haven't thought about that. So I've been here, I was at a different company when I took the course, so it was had a bit of different focus then. But certainly having that class and sort of understanding the kind of the way that the ISO 55000 ties together. So the idea of, even like, strategic asset management plan, individual asset management plan, defining the box, the tie-in from support of top management. Those sort of basic principles have really allowed me here to take on this initiative of, bringing ISO 55000 thinking into our operations and sort of defining these new practices. It still is like being able to understand that it is part of the whole. Whereas we're a services company, and very often even though we're providing services for customers, so it's a little different, where we still sort of see like, well, that's the thing we do for this, solve this problem. This is the thing we do to solve that problem, but not realizing that we operate within this context. And so I've had many opportunities here in a year and a few months to raise that conversation with my peers here, that really we are operating within a context. These things are supportive, and then now we're starting to take that to customers and say, this asset and that asset, they're different assets, but they do still operate in the same context. You need to understand them that way and plan for them that way.
Thank you. That helps. We always appreciate finding out whether what we do is having a real impact, and it sounds like it's there.
Definitely.
Yeah, from what you said earlier, Michael, about having read it, but not really fully getting it until there was the class. And I was in that class with Michael also. And one of the best things everyone was saying was the interactive discussion and learning from each other in addition to the instructors. So this is not your program, Lindsay, but since we're talking about the course, how is that achieved during the web version of the course?
Well, that's a really good question, Mike. We have a couple of things that we do differently from your typical online course. We call our course a hybrid because we in fact do have live instructor-led sessions in addition to the pre-recorded lectures. And we also have forums that we will pose a question and on an online forum, and then the students will actually start answering and having conversations in these forums. And between those two approaches, our students have said that they still feel that the interaction with the other students is a large part of the value they derive from the course.
Yeah.
And Alex Barenblit from LMI says it works well. He and his team have taken the course. His large team have taken the
Yeah,
course.
we've had 3 cohorts from LMI, so yeah.
Great.
And Michael, Annette has a follow-up question. He says, well, so leadership, yeah, but then what's next? What do you think the next step is?
Well, I do remember, well, and I was just thinking of a conversation a couple of weeks ago with a customer where we were talking about essentially defining who the stakeholders are.
Mhm.
And that I think is always an enlightening conversation. So it's normally the first pass, I think, on that conversation is too narrow. So they're on, well, it's just these 5 people or these whatever 27 people. But you first start broadening out the definition of who the stakeholders are, because eventually when you really have that kind of back and forth, you end up at a place where in some ways you defined who benefits from the assets, who benefits from what we've defined as our asset management system box, and then what do you do with that to serve those stakeholders? And so, yeah, so for me, that's probably the next step, but I think, I sort of defer to others if that's the way you would actually consult around that. But I think that I don't think people really understand, well, I'd say it differently. I think people understand the value they derive from assets better after they have defined who the stakeholders really are.
Yeah, so, my experience is that the stakeholder discussion, when you're working on the SAMP, the stakeholder discussion is almost iterative with the scope discussion.
Oh, yeah.
In that, sometimes you get, well, we're the Washington, D.C. Metro, and we're talking about, the metro system. That's the asset we're talking about. Well, so then the scope is more straightforward in a more diverse organizations. And I think when you start to get to actually include personal property and other kinds of assets and fleet, that it challenges people to include in the scope all the asset types. IT assets, famously, it's like, well, it's all our personal property except the IT. Well, isn't everything an IT asset? But, have you seen that? It kind of goes back and forth between if you add more assets to your scope, all of a sudden there's more stakeholders, right?
Yeah, exactly right. So sometimes we're talking, a lot of times for us, we're talking about facilities, and everybody almost universally start, well, the facility is the building. Okay. So so then what's included here, right? What's a capital, system or a piece of the building? You start, well, the components of the building, but then it's like, well, what about outside? Oh yeah, well, the building doesn't really exist, does it, without some way for people to park their cars, without some way for people to access the site, and oh yeah, there's all the other things too. It's fascinating. I just find that part of the conversation fascinating when I think that is more the scope, but to your point, they go together, because then it's like, oh yeah, so it's not just, my, fire suppression system, right? It's not really it. That's, it's, what purpose does that serve? How is it part of the building? Oh, and then there's the other people, and then it's employees, and then it's customers, and yeah, it goes on and on.
So it reminded me that I haven't heard from Mike Bordenaro in a couple of years now, but he used to have this whole rant where everything is about the facility. It's all about the facility.
Okay.
Is that right, Mike?
Well, I'm learning also. And the message that Jim is really cycling back to is something we learned from the Coast Guard. Our good friend Jack Dempsey started his presentations showing a slide of the Coast Guard pulling someone out of the water. The mission is saving person's life every day. And if you cannot relate to this mission every day, then you're extraneous to us and you should be gone. And it forced me, it took a long time. So even if I'm mopping the floor, I've got to mop it so that if a Coast Guard cutter pulls up and has to run in to get something and then run out, they're not going to slip on the floor. When I realized that, it's like, okay, I see a path to making everybody focused on mission, and got less focused on buildings. Buildings serve the mission.
There you go.
Interesting, just, and that's been our experience with the US tag and then the ALN is there's so many silos, sectors, involved in asset management. And, 6 years ago, we all thought we were it, personal property. I thought that was it. Mike thought BIM was it, you thought, perhaps facilities was it.
Right.
But we've all learned so much, and in the best practices from each of those and the standards in each of those. And ultimately how they're really, as Mike says, all the same thing. We're going the same place,
So Jim has said that although we're talking about asset management, what we really have to drive home is the fact that we're talking about people and how the assets serve the people who are achieving the mission of the organization. And we're just starting to message that and figure out how to get that across. But I think when we figure it out, it'll be really important.
So what's your famous 3 points, Jim? People, stuff, and I can't remember the third one.
people, money, and stuff. Yeah.
People, money, and stuff. There you go. Yep.
What else is there? I don't know. Well, ideas, but what you need, the infrastructure.
Right.
So back, I did want to mention, I haven't had a chance to read the article yet. In fact, I have yet to get through Biden's whole infrastructure speech. I keep getting interrupted by interesting phone calls. But there was, apparently there's a story of one woman in an inner city somewhere that talked about interstate highway coming through her neighborhood.
Mm.
And it's part of the infrastructure plan now. That stakeholder, and not just in who you're getting value, but that value could be negative. Impacting the process.
She's a woman of color who lives in a economically challenged community that was disrupted greatly by the addition of a highway, and she says, move it someplace else and let us have our community back. And it looks like that's part of the plan.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. There are lots of stories about that. I mean, that's one of the horror stories, really, of the urban renewal and interstate highway system is, it was built through Black neighborhoods and not through white neighborhoods, et cetera. Urban renewal, same thing. I have a story, and I think I've shared on this before, from Erie, Pennsylvania, that there was a vibrant Black community, and they basically tore it all down and put in bowling alleys and Holiday Inns. It's like, wow, that's great.
Yeah.
Put that stuff somewhere else. Yeah. Well, Mike, we got any more questions, or can we let Michael go now? Well,
You can ask a final question if you want.
Let's see. I think I used all my questions. Is that possible?
Is there anything we
sure.
didn't, is there
Oh,
anything
that's
we didn't ask you about, Michael, that you thought we were going to ask you about?
That's a great question. Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I will say I've also joined the TC 251. So I also haven't really got engaged there yet, but I would encourage people that are interested in the standard to get involved in crafting it the next iteration. And Chris Goley's sort of making room for everybody to participate and encouraging people to join. It's you know, the cost of doing it isn't a barrier anymore. It's just a matter
How much
of
is
time.
that? How much is that?
It's just $100 a year, essentially, to be part of it now. And, you know, anybody that's involved in this and cares about this work, I think would be welcome to be part of the, you know, the group working on the next, you know, making ISO 55000 better.
Did you go to a website to sign up for that?
I didn't. I contacted Jennifer Turbin.
Tercy
Tercy, thank you. I was trying to remember that off the top of my head.
Yeah.
At ASTM and
So you can go to the ASTM website and search for TC 251, Technical Committee 251, which is the one that feeds into the ISO 55000.
Or they can send me an email at jdieter@assetleadership.net. I'd be happy to steer them in the right direction.
Yep.
Well, Michael, thank you
That's
very
it.
much for joining us today. It's
My pleasure.
it's amazing the lengths I have to go to get to sit down and talk to you. You know,
I know.
that's what
Usually
happens
so
with
much easier.
successful people. They're busy, I guess. You know.
Well, busy anyway. Look forward to it again.
Okay. And thanks, Mike Boldenaro. And
And thanks to all of our attendees. We appreciate you spending time with us and look forward to talking with you next Thursday with Bill Brodt from NASA. It is rocket science.
It is rocket science.
and the week after that is Bill Garrett from the GSA Office of Government-Wide Policy.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.